I'm Shadi Sharif, and this is Cyborg. In the 1980s, the actor Tom Hanks starred in the movie Big. And the story goes that a 12-year-old boy just wishes that he could grow up and be an adult. And one night he goes to bed and he wakes up and that dream comes true because he wakes up as a 30-year-old man. And as an adult, he gets to eat whatever he wants, he gets to stay out as late as he wants, he gets his dream job just playing with toys all day. But eventually, he realizes that being an adult isn't all it's hyped up to be. He has to start making difficult decisions, he has a lot of pressure on him, and he has to take care of a lot of responsibilities. And at the end of the movie, all he wants is to go back to being a kid and living a simple and responsible free life. Parents and kids have specific roles in families. Parents traditionally are there to provide care and support to their kids, and kids get to enjoy all of that from their parents. But what happens if those roles are switched? What happens if a kid has to take on really adult responsibilities and from a young age is expected to take care and guide their family? In today's episode, I'm joined with Negin Muallim, who is a licensed psychotherapist specialized in people struggling with eating disorders, their families, and the BIPOC community. And together, we're going to explore how roles can be reversed in immigrant families and the effects that it can have on both parents and kids. So Negin, welcome to Cyborg.
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to have you on the show because not only are you from an immigrant family, but also you have a wealth of clinical knowledge, and I'm so excited to hear your perspective. So maybe we could just start off with you giving a little bit background on yourself, where you come from, and then where are you at right now?
So I was born in Iran, and I moved to Turkey when I was 9 years old for 9 months as a refugee with my family. We were religion refugees, and we left the country, lived in Turkey for 9 months, and then came to Denver, Colorado. I think I was 10 or 11 by the time I came to Denver, Colorado.
And some people might not know that we are actually family. So our moms are cousins, which I think makes us second cousins. So I remember very clearly when you all immigrated to the US. And I'm curious, if you look back before you all immigrated here, how would you describe your relationship with your parents?
So before we immigrated to the United States, my parents were actually under a lot of pressure. So it's really hard to describe my relationship with them because my mom was struggling with her own mental illness, which means she struggled to also be present with us. And my dad was at work as the only source of income, and there was financial pressures and other type of troubles that they had to deal with. So I would say I was just a kid that just tried to make sure I didn't make too much problems because there was already enough problems everybody had to deal with.
Wow, I can only imagine how hard it was going through that situation. So I'm curious, obviously your family immigrated to the US, but if you look back on when they were considering whether to immigrate or not, do you remember how they came about that decision? Was it something that your parents decided on their own, or was it something that they discussed with you?
I think my mom was asking my dad to move to America since my brother was a young child. And he's 9 years older than me, so before I was even born. But she was able to finally convince him when my brother was becoming college age and he wasn't allowed to go to university in Iran because of our religion. And it's really hard to have a future when you can't really get an education and you don't have a lot of money that you can just live off of or start a business. So that was primarily the reason my dad was convinced. It was just the idea of staying was scarier than the idea of selling everything and leaving for a new opportunity. So he was in his 50s, my mom was in her 40s when they decided to do this. They didn't know the language.
Yeah, and I think you're bringing up a really interesting point about gender differences in terms of immigration. So, people might think that immigration typically occurs more with men. But when we look on average, women almost make up half of the number of people that immigrate worldwide. And what's even more interesting is how that decision is made in families. And there's really limited research on this, but I will say from an anecdotal perspective and people that I've encountered, I find that at least from people migrating from the Middle East, women tend to want to migrate a lot more than men, and they are the ones who are initiating these conversations and trying to push their partners to migrate. So it's interesting that that was the same experience you're describing in your family. So I'm curious, although you were just a kid, what your impression of America was at that time.
It's really hard because I was 9. So what I was thinking about was bigger malls, really big toys. Like, I would think of Walmart as this like amazing place that we didn't have something like that. Which now I'm like, Walmart, ugh. I wouldn't even go there now. But at the time, it was this bigger, better, bigger toys, just bigger buildings. I just thought of it as really like heaven on earth is what people would describe it as.
That makes sense. And I definitely agree that people all over the world, not just kids, believe that America is the best place to live. And I feel really lucky that I was able to grow up here from a young age. So I'm curious how that initial period was like when you first came. Did your parents know how to speak English?
It took my mom, God, I can't put it in years, no, because my mom can have conversation now. She has a heavy accent. She still struggles sometimes if she wants to maybe get into detail about something, but she can like handle her day to day and stuff. But my parents are both still struggling. I'm still translating for them a lot of times and navigating situations. Like when I'm present, it's known that I take over and I order for everybody. I make sure everyone's sad. They just relax at that point. So that's still a thing.
Right. And this experience you're describing is actually a lot more common than people might think, in that when immigrant families migrate here with younger kids, the kids typically know the language better, they understand the culture more, and parents start relying on them to navigate these systems. And there's almost a role reversal between parents and kids. And typically in psychology, they view role reversals in parent relationships as a negative thing. But I would say that it's a lot more complicated and not so black and white when it comes to immigrant families. So I'm curious if you could describe that experience a little bit more.
Yeah, ever since I've been here and my brother has been here, like we moved to the United States, we have definitely taken over paying for the bills, translating letters, going to the pharmacy with my parents to make sure they can get their meds, doctor's appointments, phone calls, even to even teacher parent conference. Like if I really wanted to just like pretend like I like lie when the teacher said something, I could because I was the one translating. But I don't know why I didn't.
You were honest.
I was honest, yes. So yeah, I definitely took those roles. I remember even signing checks. I would even sign my excused absences myself, yeah.
I can only imagine how hard it was navigating these situations when you yourself are still a kid. So I'm curious, how did this impact your relationship with your parents?
Yeah, it definitely impacted it because I felt like I should have more independence that they were willing to give, especially because I was doing very adult things, but to them I was this child still, so it created a lot of conflict. And I actually call my parents by their first name, which is I think probably as a result of that experience. Like just recently I started calling my mom mommy again, but which is just to be cute, but like I usually call her by her first name and I call my dad by his first name too, which most people find really odd.
That makes sense. And when psychologists have looked specifically at immigrant families who experience this role reversal, and they look at the kids who are navigating these systems, the results they find are mixed. So, some studies suggest that it makes kids more independent, more self sufficient, it builds their confidence. But then other studies suggest that it can affect their mental health and it's associated with higher rates of anxiety and other disorders. So I'm curious what your personal experience was like with that.
Mine was both, and I think it affects people both of those ways. And what I mean by that is that I was self sufficient with anxiety and depression.
Right.
There's no other choice. You got to get it done because the level of pressure that's on your shoulders is different than your counterparts. And that's very obvious. And you're someone who's not an immigrant doesn't understand that. Like, I remember this example just came up in my mind. I remember being in Chicago. We were there for like a conference. A lot of people go every year, and I was the one that was driving my parents around, renting the car, making sure we got our flights, everything. Like, think of an assistant. What do? They do everything for you. I did all that, made sure they were set. What they had to do, just bring their documents and make sure they're packed. And when we were there, I also made sure that I drove them around and took them out to the city. And other kids wouldn't have to do that. They would just maybe like have their parents book the flight. They would get on the flight and then their parents can go hang out and maybe they would go do their own thing. But I had a responsibility. I couldn't just go and hang out with people because I had to make sure my parents were set. And then when it was nighttime, maybe 9 p.m., and my brother wasn't around, then I would then I would go and start my time with my friends or whoever that I had met there that I made friends with. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's very much like you have this responsibility and everyone's aware in the family that you're carrying this responsibility and they're appreciative of it, but there's no one else that's going to do it. So of course you're going to develop anxiety when you have to navigate very adult things as a child, and also translate, and also not be the one that makes the financial decisions. So you have to be like, it's this much. Would you be okay with that? Instead of being like, you know what, let me just take care of it. Like, I'm an adult now. If I do something, it's like I make all the decisions. Mm-hmm. And I just take care of it and we go in smooth. Before, I was a translator. Then I had to ask them if they were okay with it. Then try to like translate their questions. It's very anxiety provoking for a child to be in that position, mm-hmm. and have to maybe ask uncomfortable questions they don't want to, but their parents are forcing them to, mm-hmm. Because they're trying to also navigate what they're doing. So I would say, yes, it makes you self-sufficient because it forces you to learn things before it's your time, but you also have anxiety through it because it's overwhelming to be under that much pressure.
Definitely. And I think you're bringing up a really good point because when it comes to that mental health aspect, psychologists find that it also is very dependent on the experience of the young person. So if a kid finds that navigating these systems is really stressful, then that's associated with higher rates of mental health difficulties. But on the flip side, if they take pride in doing it, if they enjoy doing it, then that's associated with lower rates of mental health difficulties. And I'm curious, if we look at your parents' perspective, how they interpreted and experienced this role reversal. Because I think on the one hand, they might feel really appreciative of all the support and guidance that you're giving them. But I think on the other hand, they might feel embarrassed or maybe even shame that they have to rely on their kid to get around.
I think it's definitely really hard for them to accept the help. They try to do as much as they can on their own. But at the same time, it's understandable. Like, imagine being 40 and in your 40s and 50s, having to go to a new country and figure it all out and understand the laws and the system after being used to a certain way. So to some degree, we try to normalize it, that we both need each other's help. There's certain things that they're good at that I still need their help with, especially cultural things and being able to stay within the community. But then there's these logistical things that they need my help with. So they're very appreciative, but there's also, a hint of uneasiness that it has to be like this. But I'm happy to do it, and I don't act like it's a burden just because I know the sacrifice, the risk, vulnerability it takes to take such a big step. So I have a lot of respect for that.
That's beautiful. I'm curious if you felt the same way when you were younger in terms of helping your parents navigate these systems.
I definitely had a different experience. Yeah. Now I'm 30, so I'm in a whole new decade. But when I was early 20s, and even before I got married, and in early college, yeah, definitely very, very difficult. Especially with my brother, because he took a parent role. So we butt heads a lot. Just recently, we started having a different type of dynamic with each other where it's more friendship and not so much him telling me, no, you can't go there, or sure, or come, make sure you come home early. All the things a parent would do with their child, basically. So no, it wasn't like that. I was actually obsessed with freedom and the idea of freedom and independence. So I did whatever I could to get that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I definitely think that a desire for freedom is a really common feeling young people have in general, but especially that feeling can be amplified when you're in a more restrictive environment and feel like you can't fully express yourself. So I'm curious, did you feel supported emotionally in your house?
Right now, there is a TV show, Never Have I Ever. Yeah, that show. I think that's a really good representation of how you feel. You're like living a double life. You're trying to be at school and be this normal kid and not let the kids at school know that you've got this other weird to them life and rules that you have to live by. So, if anything, you're hiding half of who you are. So, because they don't understand it, or they're going to judge it, or they're going to have a negative response to it. So, you're kind of on your own in that sense. It was helpful to have my brother who understood some social stuff, because then I could go to prom or I could do this. It wasn't an immediate no, but I would say my parents were also really busy working 2 minimum wage jobs each, trying to make financial needs met, because we had just moved here, so we were just building our lives. So they didn't have the emotional capacity to support me then emotionally. So a lot of times I was at home after school by myself. I would entertain myself, that 70s show and the Kings of Queens.
Yes.
And some hot Cheetos.
Well, first of all, I love hot Cheetos. But second of all, I think you're bringing up a really great point, which is that the cultural differences that exist between the parents and kids can cause a divide, and it can lead people to, like you're saying, live a quote unquote double life where they have to present a certain way in the outside world and then they're really different at home. So I'm curious, obviously now you're an adult and you have a wealth of experience. If you were to give a piece of advice to a young person who is in a situation like you where they are navigating systems for their parents and there's been a role reversal, what advice would you give them?
My biggest advice is find yourself a good older cousin, because I had my own cousin at that time. I think my older cousin at the time was Nadia. She was, for a period of time when I was in high school, she was living with us with her husband because they had just moved to the States. I think for like a good half a year, I had her support nearby. And anytime my parents wouldn't understand something, I would just vent to her and she would just listen. And that just was so helpful to just have anyone that even understand what you're going through, that your parents are reacting like this to something that should be really normal. So I would say, yeah, find an older cousin who gets it, who's been through it. Yeah.
I love that. So almost someone who's an advocate in your family who's going to support you and stand up for you.
Yeah, because then I would have her go talk to my mom too. She was so... When you say advocate, I'm like, oh, yeah, she definitely did that.
Aww. And then I'm curious, if you were to give a piece of advice to a parent who's immigrated to the US and has younger kids, what you might tell them.
Oh, wow, that's hard because I'm not a parent yet myself, but I have the experience of the child. It's hard for me to speak from that sense because I can only imagine what it's like to come with your children from a different country, being raised with completely different beliefs and culture, and then having to accept something new and having to listen to your kid tell you how it goes. It's just hard to put myself in that situation. So I don't know if I have advice, but something that I really appreciate about my mom specifically is that she really tried to adapt to this culture for me, especially when it comes to dating and stuff. And that really helped me to know I have at least one parent that somewhat gets it and I don't have to hide absolutely everything. So being, I guess, adaptable to some of the cultural norms that you're choosing to live in. Like, you're, as a parent, when you're choosing to come to the United States and you're choosing to live in this culture and raise your kids in this culture, it's only fair to also empathize with your child who's being raised in this culture and adapt some of it so that they don't have to feel like they're constantly living this double life, and can have like a bridge between the two worlds.
That's a great point. And I definitely believe how parents react to the culture that they enter and how accepting they are of it has a huge impact. And I'm going to actually be diving deeper on that specific subject in an upcoming episode, so stay tuned. Negin, thank you so much for coming on the show today and sharing your perspective with us. I've learned so much from chatting with you.
I'm sure there's some tea in there for everyone.
And for those of you who want to stay connected with Negin, you can find her profile on psychologytoday.com. Intro music was written by Optin Akrami. And if you're interested in the research I referenced, you can find a complete list on our website at cyborg.info.